I've recently returned from my second trip to Israel since October 7th, and while many things have changed since that first visit, I will say one thing that remains is a sense among Israelis that they are in many ways alone in the world. And that doesn't come from nowhere. It actually comes from our Torah portion. Listen to the words. God said, "I hereby make a covenant. Before all your people, I will work such wonders as have not been wrought on the earth or in any other nation. And all the people who are with you shall see how awesome are Adonai's deeds, which will be performed for you." So there is already from the very beginning at Mount Sinai, where we became a people, there is a description, there is an assignment that we will be somehow unique among all the peoples of the world. Of all the peoples, God strikes a unique covenant with the Jewish people. And this has been, I'll say it honestly, both a blessing and a curse. Why were we given this unique covenant? We do not know. The Torah doesn't say. And we have been both celebrating and lamenting the fact of this uniqueness ever since Sinai. This covenant has been a source of strength and sorrow, a source of triumph and trial. For better and for worse, we are locked into this contract with the God of all. Samuel Langhorne Clemens was a peace activist and a human rights activist. Better known by his pen name, Mark Twain, he was a Presbyterian, critical of organized religions and of certain elements of Christianity as well. But this is what he had to say about the Jewish people in 1899, when anti-Semitism was widespread in the United States where he lived. His words first appear in print in Harper's Magazine. "If the statistics are right, the Jews constitute but 1% of the human race." That's not true. It's less than that. "It suggests a nebulous, dim puff of stardust lost in the blaze of the Milky Way. Properly, the Jew ought hardly to be heard of, but he is heard of and has always been heard of. He is as prominent on the planet as any other people, and his commercial importance is extravagantly out of proportion to the smallness of his bulk. His contributions to the world's list of great names in literature, science, art, music, finance, medicine, and obtuse learning are also way out of proportion to the weakness of his numbers. He has made a marvelous fight in this world in all the ages and has done it with his hands tied behind his back. He could be vain of himself and be excused for it. The Egyptians, the Babylonians, and the Persians rose, filled the planet with sound and splendor, and faded to dream stuff and passed away. The Greeks and the Romans followed and made a vast noise, and they too are now gone. Other peoples have sprung up and held their torch high for a time, but it burned out, and they sit in twilight now, or have vanished altogether. The Jew saw them all, beat them all, and is now what he always was, exhibiting no decadence, no infirmities of age, no weakening of his parts, no slowing of his energies, no dulling of his alert and aggressive mind. All things are mortal, Mark Twain says. All things are mortal except the Jew. All other forces pass, but he remains. What is the source of his immortality? The source of the immortality, the eternality of the Jewish people is this covenant struck at Sinai. We are only as good and worthy as how we fulfill that covenant, how we bring Torah and mitzvot to life. That is the secret of our immortality, because through Torah we chain ourselves to the eternal God. It is our chance at a piece of eternity, the fulfillment of that covenant. So yes, we can agree with Mark Twain. The Jewish people is an anomaly of human history, a surprising fact of human history. Global Jewry, we are a very small people, just 15.7 million souls. We are 0.2% of the world's 8 billion people. We should be hardly noticed, hardly noted, and yet. And of course, there's that wild statistic that we love to point to: 22% of all Nobel Prize recipients are Jewish. That is, our share of Nobel laureates is 110 times our proportion of the world's population. So we are not big in numbers. Despite God's promise to Abraham in Genesis that we would become a great nation with as many descendants as the stars of heaven and the sands of the seashore, by the time we get to Deuteronomy, God has another plan. And God clarifies that we will always be a small people. There it is written, "For you are a people consecrated to the eternal your God. Of all the peoples on earth, the eternal your God chose you to be treasured. Am Sigula, a treasured people. And it is not because you are the most numerous of peoples that the Eternal One set God's heart upon you. Indeed, you are the smallest of peoples, and you will always be among the smallest of peoples, but it was because the Eternal singled you out and kept the promise God made with your ancestors, that God would free you with a mighty hand and rescue you from the house of bondage, from the power of great Pharaoh, king of Egypt." A little more than a week ago, you may have heard the words of Lord David Wolfson. He stood alone in the British House of Lords to call out how Israel is treated differently, uniquely, both internationally and in Great Britain itself. He said, "Last year, the UN General Assembly condemned Israel 14 times. The rest of the world put together, 7 times. Since 2015, the score stands at Israel 140, the whole rest of the world put together, 68. The UN Human Rights Council has a standing agenda item, that is item number 7, which is focused on Israel and only on Israel. And this is the same Human Rights Council which just 2 days after October 7th held a minute of silence to mourn, and he quotes directly from their website, "The loss of innocent lives in the occupied Palestinian territory and elsewhere." He says in the House of Lords, "For 2,000 years the Jewish people had nowhere. Now, according to the UN Human Rights Council, we have an elsewhere. All this is not because Israel is wicked, let alone uniquely wicked. It is because internationally Israel is treated uniquely and singled out. Yes, we don't know why, but it is a matter of history, unique and singled out." Matty Friedman, who comes from Toronto and has made Aliyah to Israel and is one of our leading journalists, tells a similar story about how focused, I think he even called it obsessed, the world's journalists are with Israel. He explains that when he was working for the Associated Press, there were 40 full-time journalists dedicated to studying Israel and Palestine. Even though we live on a piece of land that is 1/100th of 1% of the surface of the world, and 1/5 of 1% of the landmass of the Arab world. More journalists are set to cover Israel than all of China by the Associated Press. More journalists are set to cover Israel than all 50 countries of sub-Saharan Africa combined. Why is this? We do not know. But we can turn again to our sacred texts for some hints as to why this may be and what on earth is it to mean for us. The prophet Isaiah famously said, "O God, in your grace, you have summoned the people Israel. You have grasped them by the hand, for you created us and appointed us to be an am leor goyim, to be a covenant people, a covenanted people among the nations, a light among the nations of the world." Isaiah's charge and challenge is this role of being a source of light to the world. That's a heavy weight to carry. Like those tablets of the law in Moses' arms. It doesn't seem fair to put all that on this uniquely small people. We did not ask to play this role in the world, and sometimes we don't want to have any part of it. But consider, as religious people, what might it mean to have been given a God-given role to play for the sake of all the world? And how might we rise to that occasion? It is not ours to suffer and wander for no purpose, but to be an emblem of how to be good and right when the world goes dark and sideways. To be an example of how to do what is necessary and just, not with perfection, but to pursue it nevertheless, even when we are misunderstood and misconstrued. This is what it is to be an am or legoyim. When I was in Israel, I came at the invitation of Rabbi Yitz Greenberg, and he taught a few times from one of his treasured teachers, Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik. And Soloveitchik famously wrote about two covenants, There is the covenant of Egypt, and there is the covenant of Sinai. The covenant of Sinai is the one that we read about from our Torah today, the one that we celebrate every day. But first, he describes the covenant of Egypt, and that is a covenant of fate. In short, the covenant we learned in Egypt and in every place that a Jew has suffered since is the covenant of fate. And Soloveitchik names a hard fact of history that the Jewish people is too often fated to be hated by some, to one degree or another, to be uniquely singled out to one degree or another. He writes, "Our fate does not distinguish between aristocrats and common folk, between rich and poor, between a prince garbed in royal purple and a pauper begging from door to door, between a pietist and an assimilationist. Even though we speak a plethora of languages, even though we are inhabitants of different lands, even though we look different, one may be short and dark, the other tall and blonde, even though we live in varying and unequal social and economic conditions. One may dwell in a magnificent palace and the other in a miserable hovel. We still share the same fate." And Soloveitchik writes this in the aftermath, in the shadow of the Holocaust. We know this is true, that we are wrapped up in one another. Our prayers today are wrapped up with one another. Our prayers offered up in this sanctuary are wrapped up with the prayers that are offered up in every other synagogue sanctuary across the planet. and even wrapped up with the prayers of the hostages held in Gaza. God help them. And that is why we have reserved in our sanctuary seats for those hostages, to say there is a place waiting for you here. We link our prayers to yours every day. But that is not all. Soloveitchik then says there is also this covenant of Sinai, and that is not the covenant of fate. Rather, it is a covenant of destiny. At Sinai, which we read about in all of its glory, and at every place in Sinai where Jews have flourished and proven themselves to be a blessing to humanity and an emblem of God in the world, that is when we fulfill the covenant of destiny. It is not something that is imposed upon us, but rather the covenant of destiny is something of our own choosing, of our own imagination, of our own pursuit. We are not only here as a unique and small people to survive history and all of its brutality and its ugliness. We are here to help make history with all of its glory and all of its promise. And so today, against the backdrop of so much heavy and horrific news, I ask you, what if our fate is our destiny? Could there be a merging of these two covenants that the Rav describes? Ought we at this dark hour accept our fate? As students of history, don't we know that it is true by now? And how can we then take that fact of hard history and transform it into something of destiny? Can we imagine that this narrow and constricting corner that we are in now could be understood as another opportunity to give evidence to the world about what it is to be human? Could this be the next chapter that we write in a history of pain, to teach how to do what is just and right, not with perfection, but to pursue it nevertheless, despite the pain, despite the hurt, despite the losses? Now, I know people are scared. A report just came out from the American Jewish Committee saying that 25% of current and recent university students say they avoid wearing Jewish symbols, carrying or displaying anything that might identify them as Jews. 24% of current or recent university students report feeling uncomfortable or unsafe on campus because they are Jewish. And 26% of current or recent university students say they avoid expressing their views on Israel on campus and with their classmates. I know people are scared, and some days I am too. But I'll tell you, there's nothing like being with Israelis, there's nothing like being in Israel to help us find our courage. So in any way you can, hear their voices. Wherever you can, read their stories and let them remind you of this covenant of fate and the covenant of destiny, the covenant of Egypt that can give way to a covenant of Sinai. What if we understood this trying time not as a test for us, but for all the world? And what if we consider this unique role that we might play in correcting something in the world, learning something about the world and teaching something about the world, teaching something about humanity and about God's desires and hopes for us all? We did not ask for this covenant at Sinai, but we did choose it. And we choose it again and again. Some days we may wish to say no thank you, but we must help one another each day At every stage and phase of Jewish history, we must help one another to say yes, yes, I will embrace this covenant of destiny, so that together we will not only endure this chapter, but we will embrace it and leverage it for all it's worth, as our ancestors did when they stood at the foot of the mountain and heard God's call. We will accept it, we will embrace it, we will lift it up for all the world to see. Let it be our noble and purposeful mission. Amen.